December 1940. In the shadowed walls of the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing across his lips. Around him, the Luftwaffe's highest commanders gathered, faces tight with pride and certainty, sipping their schnapps and trading jabs at an enemy they believed unprepared. Roosevelt's claim that America could produce 50,000 aircraft a year had reached them weeks before. To these men it was not just improbable, it was laughable. 50,000! Hermann Goering had scoffed, the lines of his face twisting in amusement. The Americans can barely assemble a car in a day, and now they imagine fleets of Spitfires rising from their factories. The room erupted in chuckles, each officer more convinced than the last that the industrial might of the United States was a myth, a bluff made to intimidate European powers. Hitler's eyes narrowed, not with anger but with condescension. He traced a finger along a map of the Atlantic, pointing to the scattered dots of U.S. cities. They think they can match us? Their factories are nothing but tin and wood compared to our steel and discipline. They are children playing at war. The commanders laughed again, a chorus of disbelief echoing through the marble halls. But beneath the humor, a subtle unease stirred. The Wehrmacht's calculations assumed European dominance, rapid victory, and limited American intervention. No one yet imagined the coming transformation. The assembly lines humming from dawn to dusk, the roaring furnaces of Detroit, the relentless hum of machinery in cities like Seattle, St. Louis, and Dallas. The Americans were about to redefine production, and in ways that no map, no briefing, and no mocking laughter could foresee. Hitler rose, straight-backed and commanding, yet even as he gestured to dismiss the men, the shadow of doubt passed unnoticed in the room. Across the ocean, plans were already underway that would soon render his confidence obsolete. By the time the first fully armed B-17s and P-51 Mustangs filled the skies over Europe, the Reich's calculations would be revealed as naive, even fatal. The laughter of December 1940 would echo in history, but not in triumph. The world was about to witness a spectacle of American industrial ingenuity, a storm of steel and fire that Hitler had mocked, a force that would overwhelm expectations, crush assumptions, and force the Fuhrer to confront an uncomfortable truth. History is written not by prophecy, but by production. But Hitler didn't realize that America's factories were about to make history. In the late 1930s, the United States wore the scars of a decade-long economic nightmare. Cities still bore the shadows of breadlines. Factories that once hummed with promise now stood silent, and a generation of Americans had learned to live with uncertainty. Washington's military budgets were modest, the Army and Navy lean, and the idea of a formidable air force was barely a whisper among policy circles. Airplanes were curiosities, prized by barnstormers and mail pilots, not instruments of global dominance. German intelligence observed from across the Atlantic, confident in their reports. America is weak, their spies concluded. A nation of farmers, shopkeepers, and small factories. Its industrial heart is dormant. In Berlin, this intelligence reinforced a dangerous assumption. The Americans, even if roused to war, could never match the organized, battle-hardened might of the Wehrmacht. Factories in Detroit, Chicago, and smaller Midwestern towns churned out cars, refrigerators, and tractors, but aircraft production was almost negligible. By 1939, the U.S. Army Air Corps counted only a few thousand combat-ready planes, a fraction of Germany's Luftwaffe. Most aircraft were obsolete, patched and repurposed from earlier designs. Pilots trained in dusty fields, engines sputtering, practicing maneuvers more for sport than survival. To Europe, the Americans seemed charmingly unthreatening, a nation of tinkers rather than warriors. Yet beneath this veneer of weakness, a quiet transformation was beginning. Engineers tinkered in garages, inventors sketched designs that would soon soar. Contracts for new engines and bombers were quietly drafted, and the government, cautious but visionary, began investing in infrastructure that could, if pushed, rival the industrial giants of Germany and Britain. But this potential remained invisible to the Fuhrer and his commanders. who measured America's threat by its present, not its capacity to adapt. Then came December 29th, 1940. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, standing before a divided Congress, delivered a pledge that seemed almost fantastical. The United States would build 50,000 warplanes annually. Not 10,000, not 25,000. 50,000, enough to challenge the world's most advanced air forces. Newspapers across Germany reported the declaration, and in Berlin, officers scoffed again. They measured American factories in horsepower, not ambition, and dismissed the promise as political theater. But Roosevelt's words were more than rhetoric. They were a signal of resolve, a strategy that combined vision with resources. Contracts were inked, factories repurposed, and a workforce that had known unemployment was mobilized. Women in overalls replaced men at assembly lines. Teenagers operated presses and riveters, and the clamor of hammers and drills rose from cities that had slept for years. The American industrial machine was waking, slowly at first, then with unstoppable momentum. From the perspective of the Reich, none of this mattered. Their calculations assumed a European theater and a limited American response. They had yet to comprehend the scale, the speed, and the determination that Roosevelt's promise would unleash. Each rivet, each engine completed, was a step closer to a reality Germany could not predict, let alone counter. Across the Atlantic, in quiet workshops and bustling factories, a nation once dismissed as unready began to take shape. A force measured not by past weakness, but by the promise of tomorrow. And as the first blueprints were stamped, the first wings attached, and the first engines roared to life, a storm was brewing, one that would eventually sweep over Europe with a magnitude no spy report could ever have foretold. Then Roosevelt made a promise that seemed impossible. December 29th, 1940, the United States teetered on the edge of uncertainty. Abroad, Europe was aflame. France had fallen, Britain braced under relentless bombing, and Hitler's generals exuded unshakable confidence. At home, Americans struggled with the lingering shadow of the Great Depression, skeptical of the nation's ability to influence events half a world away. Into this fragile landscape stepped Franklin Delano Roosevelt, resolute, measured, and unyielding. From the podium in Washington, he addressed a divided Congress and a cautious nation, delivering words that would echo through history. The United States must become the arsenal of democracy. To Roosevelt, the arsenal was not merely a metaphor. It was a call to arms for industry, innovation, and citizen resolve. He pledged the impossible, 50,000 airplanes annually, a production goal so vast that even seasoned industrialists and military planners doubted its feasibility. Wall Street analysts and factory magnates alike raised eyebrows. 50,000, whispered executives in New York boardrooms. The plants can barely manage half that. The skilled labor, the raw materials, the engines, it's a fantasy. Across the Midwest, newspaper columns and radio broadcasts echoed the sentiment. Citizens questioned whether their country, still grappling with economic hardship, could shoulder such a monumental task. Allies, desperate yet anxious, wondered if Roosevelt's promise could become anything more than an ambitious speech. But Roosevelt's pledge was not idle rhetoric. It was a challenge, a spark meant to ignite the dormant industrial might of America. Contracts were swiftly drawn, assembling a network of plants and suppliers that would operate with unprecedented coordination. Engineers sketched new airframes, machinists measured tolerances to thousandths of an inch, and assembly lines were reimagined to accommodate the relentless pace that Roosevelt demanded. It was an industrial choreography, the likes of which the world had never seen, each rivet and bolt moving the country closer to a goal that once seemed unattainable. The psychological impact was profound. Citizens, long weary of economic struggle, found purpose in the roar of factory machinery. Women took positions once reserved for men, embracing the mantra that their labor could tip the scales of global conflict. Workers pushed limits, innovating techniques and improvising solutions, each day transforming doubt into momentum. What outsiders dismissed as fantasy became, in the hum of assembly lines and the spark of welding torches, an unstoppable reality. Even as Hitler and his generals mocked the pledge from across the Atlantic, American factories began a metamorphosis. The challenge lit a fire, one that could not be measured in reports, charts, or predictions. Each engine completed, each fuselage rolled out, became a testament to resolve, innovation, and the nation's capacity to rise beyond expectation. The world would soon see the fruits of Roosevelt's audacity, a production miracle that would shock Berlin and force the Fuhrer to confront a reality far beyond his calculations. But the challenge lit a fire in America's factories. By early 1941, the heartbeat of America's industrial revolution had shifted from asphalt and chrome to steel and propellers. Detroit, once the capital of cars, became the epicenter of an audacious experiment, turning automotive factories into machines of war. Ford's Willow Run plant, a sprawling cathedral of steel and concrete, epitomized the transformation. Here, assembly lines that once birthed Mustangs and Fords now stretched endlessly, producing the B-24 Liberator, a four-engine bomber that would dominate the skies over Europe. It was not only the giant corporations that pivoted. Boeing's factories in Seattle thrummed with renewed purpose, producing the B-17 Flying Fortress with meticulous precision. Thousands of smaller manufacturers, machine shops, parts suppliers, and even furniture makers were drawn into the orbit of war production. Their machines repurposed to shape wings, fuselages, and propellers. Within months, a national network had emerged, linking towns, cities, and states into a seamless production pipeline. The human element was as remarkable as the engineering feat. Men and women, many of them previously unemployed or working in low-paying jobs, were retrained almost overnight. Farmhands learned to operate rivet guns with precision. Secretaries became draftspersons, reading blueprints with the same care they once gave ledgers. Women donned overalls and steel-toed boots, mastering complex machinery with a speed that astonished even seasoned engineers. Children too young for the battlefield watched in awe as parents contributed to a production miracle, their understanding of war reshaped by the clang of metal and the roar of engines. Ford's Willow Run plant, designed to be the largest bomber factory in the world, became a symbol of this unprecedented effort. Long before dawn, convoys of raw materials, aluminum, steel, wiring, and engines arrived at the plant gates. Workers moved with machine-like efficiency, forming a human river along assembly lines that stretched nearly a mile. The first B-24s rolled out, not as prototypes, but as fully operational aircraft, tested and armed for combat missions over Europe. Meanwhile, Boeing's B-17 lines were evolving at a pace that defied traditional expectations. Innovations in production methods, modular assembly, standardized parts, and synchronized schedules allowed for rapid scaling. A machine shop in Wichita might produce fuselage sections that were immediately shipped to Seattle, arriving ready for final assembly. The integration of such logistics required vision, planning, and an unwavering commitment to precision. The impact on morale was palpable. Workers, once skeptical of Roosevelt's pledge, now saw their labor take tangible form. Each completed bomber represented more than a machine. It was proof that America could bend reality to its will. Families across the nation followed the news with a mix of pride and astonishment, as photographs of gleaming bombers lined up on airfields filled newspapers and magazines. Across the Atlantic, German intelligence still clung to its outdated assumptions. The Reich underestimated not only the scale of production, but the speed at which these factories could adapt and expand. Hitler's generals mocked reports of impossible production numbers, believing that logistical challenges and material shortages would eventually halt the American push. They could not see the reality: a nation mobilized, innovating and executing with relentless momentum, and soon planes began rolling out not by the dozens, but by the hundreds. by late 1941, across the Atlantic, confidence in Berlin remained unshakable, at least on the surface. Hitler and his generals believed that the United States, despite its size, was an industrial backwater compared to the disciplined might of Germany. Their reports painted a picture of slow, inexperienced workers, factories incapable of sustained output, and a population more accustomed to leisure than labor. Even Roosevelt's pledge of 50,000 planes annually was dismissed as political theater, an empty promise from a nation they assumed could not deliver. German planners failed to account for the transformative power of mass production. The lessons of Henry Ford, the genius of assembly lines, and the adaptability of American industry were ignored or dismissed as quaint relics of peacetime efficiency. They could not imagine plants that operated 24 hours a day, combining mechanization with human ingenuity, churning out bombers, fighters, and transports at a pace that defied expectation. Perhaps most crucially, the Reich underestimated the role of women in the American war effort. While German propaganda confined women to domestic spheres, the United States was mobilizing an entirely new labor force. Millions of women, previously sidelined in factories and offices, now mastered rivet guns, cranes, and press machines. They worked tirelessly alongside men, turning raw materials into aircraft, engines, and bombs with precision and speed. Their contribution was invisible to German eyes, yet it became one of the key pillars of the production miracle. Even within the Luftwaffe, intelligence reports were slow to catch up. Early reconnaissance underestimated output, producing only partial, outdated figures that confirmed pre-existing biases. Hitler and his commanders believed that even if America produced planes, the quality would be insufficient for sustained combat. They imagined thinly trained crews, fragile machines, and logistical bottlenecks that would neutralize any threat. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the reality was starkly different. Detroit, Seattle, Wichita, and dozens of smaller hubs were producing aircraft with astonishing efficiency. Modular assembly lines allowed simultaneous construction of multiple sections. Engines and fuselages were shipped across states, ready for final assembly. Even minor delays were mitigated through innovative scheduling and relentless oversight. The combination of mechanized precision, human adaptability, and sheer determination created an industrial juggernaut Berlin had not anticipated. Hitler's miscalculation was not born of ignorance alone. It was a product of arrogance and rigid thinking. He measured American capability through the lens of European industry, disciplined, hierarchical, and historically proven. He could not see a nation whose strength lay in flexibility, innovation, and the willingness of its citizens to rise beyond expectation. As the first reports of staggering American output filtered through German intelligence, panic remained tempered by disbelief. The Reich's leaders clung to assumptions, hoping that production numbers were inflated or that logistical problems would soon emerge. They did not yet understand that the illusion of American weakness had already been shattered in factories across the continent. That illusion would shatter in the skies. By 1942, the United States had crossed a threshold that few in Berlin, London, or even Washington had fully grasped. The factories that once produced cars, tractors, and household goods were now humming with relentless purpose, converting raw steel, aluminum, and labor into instruments of war. Aircraft were no longer occasional deliveries or experimental runs. They were a tidal wave, an industrial flood that grew stronger with every month. The B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator dominated long-range bombing campaigns, their numbers climbing faster than German intelligence dared to believe. The P-38 Lightning and P-51 Mustang, sleek and deadly, tore through skies once dominated by the Luftwaffe. Cargo planes and transports like the C-47 Skytrain carried troops, supplies, and weapons across oceans and continents, sustaining Allied campaigns from North Africa to the South Pacific. Each plane was a testament not only to engineering, but to the coordination, vision, and determination of an entire nation. Factories in Detroit, Seattle, Wichita, and beyond became symphonies of human and mechanical precision. Shifts ran 24 hours, machines clanking, sparks flying, rivets falling into place with metronomic rhythm. Workers, trained in months instead of years, became masters of their craft almost overnight. Women, once thought incapable of industrial labor, operated presses, cranes, and welding equipment with a skill and speed that stunned visiting engineers. Even teenagers contributed, assisting with assembly and logistics, their hands shaping the engines that would decide the fate of continents. The psychological impact on Germany was profound, though delayed. Berlin received reports, often fragmentary and incomplete, of astonishing production numbers. Yet Hitler and his generals, conditioned by years of European warfare, initially dismissed these figures as exaggerations. They compared American output to traditional benchmarks of European industry, forgetting that the United States possessed scale, flexibility, and ingenuity in numbers the Reich could never match. By the end of 1943, the scale was undeniable. America was producing more aircraft in a single year than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. The raw figures alone, tens of thousands of planes, were staggering. Even more astonishing was the rate at which new designs were integrated. Engineers and pilots were not waiting for slow, bureaucratic approval. Innovations were tested, refined, and deployed at unprecedented speed. The Luftwaffe, once the dominant aerial force in Europe, now faced an enemy whose numbers and versatility could overwhelm any tactical advantage. In parallel, Allied strategy adapted to this flood of machines. Bomber formations, once vulnerable to concentrated attacks, could now fly in massed waves, striking factories, rail lines, and oil depots deep within enemy territory. Fighter escorts like the P-51 changed the balance in dogfights, giving Allied pilots the reach and protection previously thought impossible. Every sortie, every battle, reflected not just skill in the cockpit, but the invisible hand of American factories, which produced faster than any command in Berlin could respond. By 1942-43, it was clear America was not simply catching up. It was outproducing every Axis nation combined, redefining the very mathematics of war. The Reich's assumptions, its arrogance, and its rigid planning had collided with a reality beyond comprehension. And still, America was only warming up. By 1944, the United States had achieved a feat that defied imagination. The promise that once seemed absurd, 50,000 planes annually, had not only been met, but nearly doubled. Factories across the nation roared with an intensity that Europe had never witnessed. In a single year, 96,000 aircraft rolled off American assembly lines, a mechanical tsunami that would reshape the very skies above the continent. Berlin could no longer dismiss reports of production. Hitler's earlier laughter, the mocking disbelief that Roosevelt's pledge could ever be fulfilled, had faded into unease. Luftwaffe officers, once smug in their assumptions, began to recognize the scale of what they faced. Each intercepted report, each reconnaissance photograph, revealed an overwhelming reality. Allied air power was no longer measured in dozens or hundreds, but in tens of thousands. A constant presence that threatened the Reich's very survival. The skies over Europe transformed. B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators flew in massive formations, their engines droning like a prelude to judgment. P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts zipped overhead, agile and relentless, escorting bombers deep into German territory. The sheer number of aircraft was staggering and the tactical implications immediate. Cities, factories, and rail lines were no longer safe havens. Every sortie carried destruction and strategic disruption. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin and battered by attrition, found itself constantly reacting, rarely initiating. The human dimension of this surge was equally profound. Pilots, trained to a high standard, took to the skies with confidence reinforced by overwhelming numbers. Ground crews, maintenance teams, and logistics specialists ensured that planes returned to action quickly, sustaining the relentless tempo of operations. Every day, new aircraft replaced losses, creating a feedback loop that Germany could not counter. For the first time, sheer production, not tactics alone, became a decisive weapon. In Berlin, reports filtered through the Reich Chancellery like a cold wind. Officers whispered in fear of the consequences. Entire squadrons of the Luftwaffe had been destroyed. Targets in the Ruhr and along the Rhine were in ruins, and fuel shortages compounded the crisis. Hitler, once confident in Europe's skies, now saw the consequences of underestimating an industrial titan. The mockery that had accompanied Roosevelt's pledge was replaced by anxiety, calculation, and a growing awareness that the balance of air power had irrevocably shifted. The technological innovations of American production added insult to injury. Modularity allowed rapid repairs. Standardized components meant faster maintenance. Engineers in the US continually improved engines, armaments, and aerodynamics, ensuring that aircraft not only outnumbered their adversaries, but often outperformed them. The Luftwaffe's pilots faced opponents who were not only numerous but constantly evolving, a force shaped by both quantity and ingenuity. By the end of 1944, the scale of production had reached its zenith. 96,000 aircraft, a number so vast that even seasoned German generals struggled to comprehend its implications, filled Allied airfields, ready to strike across Europe and beyond. Hitler's mockery had turned to alarm. What had once seemed impossible was now reality, and the Luftwaffe faced a storm it could not survive. The skies would no longer be Germany's dominion. The war in the air had reached a tipping point, one forged not by heroism alone, but by the unstoppable power of American industry. The Luftwaffe faced a storm it could not survive. By 1944, the skies over Europe had become a vast battlefield, and America's industrial might ensured that the Allies ruled them. What had begun as Hitler's great boast, that Germany's Luftwaffe would dominate the air, was now turning into one of his greatest strategic failures. The numbers alone told a staggering story. In 1944, the United States rolled nearly 100,000 aircraft off its assembly lines. Every month, fleets of fresh fighters and bombers arrived in Britain and Italy, while more poured into the Pacific. For the Luftwaffe, already battered by years of attrition, this was a nightmare beyond imagining. German pilots, once the elite of the skies, now faced impossible odds. Veteran aces found themselves outnumbered 10-1. Where once a formation of Bf-109s or FW-190s might confidently dive into a bomber stream, they now faced endless walls of defensive fire and squadrons of long-range escorts. The arrival of the North American P-51 Mustang, with its drop tanks giving it the range to fly deep into Germany, sealed the Luftwaffe's fate. No longer could bombers be ambushed once they left fighter cover. Now, swarms of Mustangs flew with them all the way to Berlin and back, but it wasn't just about aircraft. The German war machine was starving. Fuel reserves dwindled as Allied bombers shredded refineries and transport networks. Pilots sometimes trained on gliders or bicycles, conserving precious drops of aviation fuel. Meanwhile, America's resources seemed bottomless. Not just planes, but the oil to fly them, the spare parts to maintain them, the factories to replace them. Inside Germany, the strain showed. Luftwaffe commanders pleaded for reinforcements, but Hitler's fantasies consumed the nation's last strength. Jet programs rushed ahead in desperation, but there were never enough engines, never enough trained crews, never enough time. Against the tidal wave of Allied production, Germany's wonder weapons could only delay the inevitable. For the German pilots themselves, the skies turned into a slaughterhouse. In 1940, during the Battle of Britain, it had been Britain's Royal Air Force that fought with its back to the wall. By 1944, the roles were reversed. Fresh-faced German trainees were rushed into combat after only a few hours of flight time, facing veteran Allied formations with years of experience. The Luftwaffe was eating its young. By D-Day, the collapse was undeniable. When Allied forces stormed Normandy in June 1944, they did so under an umbrella of air power so vast that German troops barely dared move during daylight. Every convoy, every railway line, every tank column risked instant destruction from above. Even the Wehrmacht's best panzer divisions, Handy, once the terror of Europe, found themselves helpless without air cover. The Allies had achieved what military planners called air supremacy, not merely controlling the skies, but denying them to the enemy altogether. For German soldiers on the ground, this was more than a tactical defeat. It was a psychological one. The drone of Allied engines overhead meant there was no escape, no safety, no hope of turning the tide. The Luftwaffe, once the spearhead of Hitler's conquests, was now a shadow of its former self. Exhausted, underfueled, outnumbered, and outproduced, it could no longer shield Germany's cities or armies. The Reich's enemies had seized the skies, and with them, the power to decide the war's outcome. Behind every rivet, every engine, and every polished wing that rolled out of America's factories during the war was a human story. The miracle of 100,000 planes wasn't conjured by numbers on a production chart. It was built by ordinary people who answered an extraordinary call. Take the women of the assembly lines. Before the war, many had never set foot inside a factory. They were secretaries, teachers, housewives, and students. But as men shipped off to war, women stepped into overalls and safety goggles, picking up rivet guns and welding torches. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a poster. She was thousands of real women who discovered strength they never knew they had. They drilled, hammered, and bolted together the frames of B-17 bombers and P-51 Mustangs, their work echoing through cavernous hangars. Each plane they touched would soon carry a crew into combat, their fingerprints etched into the metal wings of freedom. Then there were the young men, too young or unfit for the draft, who found their role on the home front. 17-year-olds who should have been in high school shops now manned lathes and presses, producing aircraft engines with precision that belied their age. Retired craftsmen came back too, passing along skills honed over decades. America's factories became a blend of generations, united in a single mission. And on the other end of that chain were the pilots. Some were veterans, hardened by years in the cockpit. Others were barely out of flight school, climbing into aircraft so new the paint was still fresh. They trusted those machines, trusted that the rivets would hold, that the engines would roar, that the wings would not falter under fire. For many, the last touch of home they carried into battle was the handiwork of workers they would never meet. Consider a crew of a B-24 Liberator. Leaving Willow Run, the pilot knew that his bomber was one of hundreds rolling off the line that month. But to him and his men, it was the bomber, their lifeline, their chance to survive. And to the woman in Detroit who fastened its nose section, or the boy in Cleveland who machined its pistons, their unseen labor became a bond of trust across thousands of miles. The sheer scale of production could obscure the individual, yet it was individuals who gave the miracle life. For many of them, the work was grueling. 12-hour shifts 6 days a week. Noise so loud earplugs were never enough. Fingers blistered, backs aching, eyes strained from long nights under fluorescent light. And still they worked, because they knew what was at stake. There was pride, too. A riveter in California would point to a squadron flying overhead and tell her child, "I built that one." For families who had lost fathers and brothers to the war, every finished aircraft was a personal act of defiance. Hitler had mocked America as weak and divided, but the hands of these workers proved him wrong, and in the end, those hands did more than build planes. They built a bridge between ordinary lives and world-changing events. The miracle of mass production was never just about machines. It was about people. People who believed that their small effort, multiplied millions of times, could help decide the fate of nations. When the smoke cleared over Europe in 1945, the ruins told one story, but the skies told another. The Allied victory had not only been won on the ground at Normandy or in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. It had been forged in the furnaces and factories of a nation that had once doubted itself. America's achievement went beyond numbers, though the numbers were staggering. Nearly 300,000 aircraft produced during the war. More tanks than the German army could ever hope to field. More ships than the U-boats could ever sink. In a matter of just a few years, the United States had transformed from an inward-looking republic into the arsenal of democracy, capable of sustaining a global conflict on multiple fronts. For Hitler, it was the final bitter irony. He had mocked Roosevelt's 1940 pledge as naive, a fantasy fit only for propaganda. He never understood the machine that stood behind it. Not the factories, not the assembly lines, and certainly not the millions of ordinary people who would rise to the challenge. In the end, his underestimation was as decisive as any battlefield defeat. The legacy of that triumph stretched far beyond the war. The techniques of mass production pioneered in places like Willow Run and Seattle laid the foundation for a post-war boom. The same workers who had riveted bombers would later build the cars, appliances, and technologies that reshaped civilian life. And for the world, the lesson was unmistakable. Industrial power, once mobilized, could be as decisive as armies or generals. The arsenal of democracy was not just a slogan. It was a promise kept, a vision realized, and a warning to those who underestimated it. The men and women who built 100,000 planes did more than outproduce the Axis. They reshaped the modern world and proved that willpower, when harnessed by industry, could move mountains and win wars.